on introduction, preparation to the spiritual psychology of Kabbalah, the idea of nivuah or prophecy. So when we look in earlier parts of the Bible, for example, in the book of Samuel, when Saul has an ecstatic experience and he's with a band of were called prophetic musicians, prophecy probably meant like uh, ecstatically experiencing the presence of God and breaking out in song and music. So the word lenabe or lihit nabe had the sense of channeling God's energy. Those who, as it were spokespersons for God, for example, Samuel was called a seer, a roeh, sometimes called a chozeh, which is a synonym for a seer. At some point in ancient Israelite history, the word navi, meaning someone who was taken into some kind of divine rapture, and a roeh, a seer, meaning one who saw the world through God's eyes and then gave God's judgment about the world, or a chozeh, again, similar to seer. The words combined, and then we end up with the word navi, which becomes the traditional Hebrew word for a spokesperson for God. Now remember, prophecy does not mean foretelling the future. We use it that way nowadays. Prophecy is a spokesperson for the divine, telling people what God's judgment is in one area or another, sometimes in the ritual world, sometimes idolatry, mostly in the term of morality and social ethics. But among those pronouncements of the Word of God, there would be a foretelling of the future of what would happen if people didn't. So in English, the term prophecy has become confused with, maybe in a vulgar sense, fortune telling, meaning here's what's going to happen in the future. But when you look at most of the prophetic books, they're actually not about foretelling the future. They're rather spokespersons for the divine, the divine judgment, as it were, commentary on what is happening currently. Last paragraph of thought. When the Kabbalah came into being, they went back to the original meaning of nivuah, as again we see in the book of Samuel with Saul before he became King Saul, which was the ecstatic experience of God created by the careful chanting of divine names. So Kabbalah reintroduced what is called the ecstatic Kabbalah, of which I'll be talking about just for a moment. So this is just an interesting idea how a word in Hebrew went through many, many different meanings, and in Kabbalah reverting back to its original meaning. All right, so that's my little commentary on the idea of prophecy, and now I'm going to go into my teachings on preparation, preface to the spiritual study of Kabbalah. As always, just a brief review for any newcomers. I often teach courses in the spiritual psychology of the Kabbalah. It is the most important depth practice that I teach. It certainly shapes my own work with my soul. But I realize when many people come to the spiritual study of Kabbalah, what they know of the Kabbalah is more or less impressions, statements here and there by, I think, certainly competent teachers of Kabbalah that want to reduce it to something very digestible, as it were, for the human mind. I think partly because of a fear of introducing the Kabbalah in all of its complexity. The complexity is quite daunting. But you know that my approach is, I'll teach the complexity as well as I can, as accurately as I can, try to apply it to our lives. But for those who want to try to work through the complexity, I want to offer that to you. In my opinion, if we actually study the complex history of the Kabbalah, again, in the most teachable and learnable ways possible, the practice of the spiritual psychology of the Kabbalah is only deepened. All right, so just a few brief paragraphs of thought. As you know, Gershom Scholem teaches in his book, The Kabbalah. By the way, if you're looking for Gershom Scholem's one-volume book on the Kabbalah, here it is, not surprisingly entitled Kabbalah by Gershom Scholem. I hope the letters aren't reversed. What this is a collection of Scholem and a few other people's articles in the Encyclopedia Judaica, published in 1974, all his articles and a few others articles on the Kabbalah were extracted and placed into this book. So what you have here is a compendium of Encyclopedia Judaical articles on the Kabbalah, 1974. In many ways, Sholem revisiting his lifelong work on Kabbalah. He began this work in the 14, 15, 16, 17. His doctoral dissertation was on Sefer Bahir in 1917. He translated into German with a beautiful commentary. And he wrote his book, Major Trends in Jewish Mysticism, in 1941, based on lectures that he gave at the Jewish Theological Seminary. Continued his work. So what we find here is, in many ways, Sholem looking back on his lifetime of work. He died, if I'm not mistaken, in 1987, and presenting a summary of that work. I think in his mind, for the lay audience, it really is still a book for scholars. It is so dense. But if one is willing to go through it page by page and not feel that you have to look up every reference, because it's filled with reference to obscure books, some not even available. So if you're going to read this, I would say just skip the parts of the names and skip the parts of the reference and look for his main message. Okay, so this is the one volume Gershom Scholem's treatment of the Kabbalah. Of course, there are many, many other volumes that I think are both accurate and much more accessible. Sholem says that the Kabbalah, in its historical dimension, comes from the interpenetration of Gnosticism and Neoplatonism. So again, without redoing the last several talks, Gnosticism and Neoplatonism are working on two core questions. One is, if God is real and God is present, why is the world as it is, and why are people as they are? Why don't people experience God? That's one question. And number two, why don't people behave better? You could say, why are people not kind to each other, immoral to each other, from a more benign sense? From a more dire sense, why is there evil in the world? So with these two questions, you have two basic approaches. Each approach says that God is not fully present in this world. Now, that just seems obvious. If one does believe that there is the divine, it's obvious that the divine is not reigning in this world. I mean, the divine can, as it were, through prophets, issue the law. The divine cannot enforce the law. Obviously, there are so many people that do not care about right and wrong, do not care about God's presence, go all the way to just moral indifference, all the way to evil. The Gnostic answer is that in the heavenly realms, to say far beyond human comprehension, there's been something of a tragedy in that divine beings, and again, I'm summarizing a vast literature, have rebelled against the divine. Sometimes they're called fallen angels, fallen into a lower realm, and not only have they been rebelled and dismissed from the upper realms, they've rebelled against it. And here they are in the lower realms. Again, I'm summarizing a vast number of Gnostic myths, have decided to make the lower realm their realm. Now, this goes back to the idea of the demiurge in Plato, where the demiurge is, as it were, the infinite divine emanating a craftsman into the world. Well, this is not just the craftsman idea of the demiurge in Plato, meaning God emanates an architect, a builder, as it were, into this world, creates this world. The idea of the demiurge became a set of either an evil God, strange to say it, or a rule by fallen evil angels who then, as it were, create this world, create evil in the world. And if you read some of the Gnostic books, they're actually quite horrific. If you want to take a look at just one Gnostic book in the Jewish tradition, look at the book of Enoch, Enoch. There are three versions, Enoch 1, Enoch 2, Enoch 3. They're a bit different from each other. I believe they're online. People say, well, can you tell me one Jewish Gnostic book of the many I could cite? Look at the book of Enoch. Pick it up anywhere. It's not in the Bible. It's not in the New Testament. It's not in the Midrash. It's a hidden, you might say, suppressed book available today, and it is quite horrific. You will be very happy it's not in the Bible. You'll be very happy that it's so hard to find. You'll be very happy that your children or grandchildren haven't read it. unless they've received a thorough introduction to Jewish Gnosticism. Okay, that's one answer. The other answer, roughly, is the Platonic and became the Neoplatonic idea that there is a divine, there is a source of divine light and all the qualities of divine, love, grace, goodness, etc. But that divine light, as it shines into the world, is dimmed by a set of veils, lenses, etc., to the point that by the time it gets down to this world, most people walk around not knowing that they are standing, you might say, at a lower point of the chain of being. There's a series of lenses, a series of veils. Here we are. Now, the human mind is capable of opening itself into these various lenses. We just keep our minds closed. I mean, metaphor used from last night. We can't even hear the truth knocking at the door because we're listening to everything else. Our minds, as it were, are filled with noise. I love the bit of an oxymoron. I plugged my ears so I could hear the divine knocking at the door, part of the poem that beautiful poem that Shanti shared with us last night. Now, so where do you see this kind of Platonic, Neoplatonic sense in Judaism? The main text is the Guide for the Perplexed by Maimonides. The first part of the Guide for the Perplexed is Maimonides trying to understand how the Bible can use words about God, such as God spoke, God descended, God from one place to another place, if God does not have the physical the apparatus of the human body. How could God speak? How could God go from one place to another? So Maimonides, in the first part of the Guide for the Perplexed, I hope you've all heard of this text, is a study of how to read metaphors in the Bible. It's really an exquisite study of metaphoric language. So his general conception of God is Aristotelian, but the deeper you go into the Guide for the Perplexed, he's more of a Platonist because he does believe in the idea of what Plato would call the ideal forms or the ideas, meaning if we can imagine an ultimate divine who then emanates, the ones that I like to cite are love, justice, truth, beauty, the good, the holy, etc. So those are, as it were, real, but not in an empirical sense. They're real in a value sense. Let me just digress here for a moment. I had the honor of speaking to the students at the Capstone program at De Toledo High School yesterday. I presented some of these ideas, and very predictably, the high school student said, isn't morality just a social construct? Haven't human beings just made that up? Well, it's very difficult to think about the world of value if one has been taught that the test of reality is empiricism, meaning can you observe it, can you weigh it, can you measure it, can you produce it in the laboratory, can you prove it by mathematics, natural science, etc. That's, you might say, the default position of most American institutions of learning from high school on. Discussing the reality of the world of value, I think, it's not taught. It might be beyond the capacity of many teachers to teach, because the challenges are so insistent and immediate, as I've experienced my entire adult life teaching, including yesterday. So at the very end, a student came to me and said, I loved your talk, Rabbi Finley, was really great, but very thoughtful young man, but I'm a logical person. I don't know how to understand God logically. I said, that's very fair. I said, how do you understand values? More or less, my entire talk was, do you believe in the world that the world of value exists? Do you believe there are better and worse answers, moral questions? There's no evidence. There's no evidence that there is no world of value. It's an existential choice. Do you believe we live in a moral framework? Because if you don't, that leads pretty quickly to moral relativism, which itself leads to a kind of moral nihilism. There really is no moral better and worse. It's all what anybody decides. So I said, you have to decide. I said, there's no logical answer as to whether there is a world of value. There's no logical answer. At some level, it's an existential, philosophic, religious choice. Once one decides that the world of value exists, proceed from that logically. I said to this young man, if you decide the world of value does not exist, proceed from that logically, but the starting point is axiomatic. It cannot be proven one way or the other. So I think this is something that most of you know or most of you have heard. And it's not that difficult of a concept to understand. So think of that this is a version of Platonism and Neoplatonism, that there is a world of value, but it emanates it down into the human mind to the point that many people are simply not aware that the world of value exists in a real sense. When do they know? By moral intuition. When people have moral outrage, when they have passions for issues of justice. That's when a person knows that there is a world of value. They just don't know how to argue or defend it. So people express the reality of the world of value when it comes to a case or an issue. So here's a contradiction. Again, I've experienced my entire life of teaching. When you ask somebody theoretically, they say, it's all empirical. There's no world of value because it can't be empirically proven. But when they come to a case, they speak and behave as if the world of value is real. That's okay with me. I'm filled with my own contradictions. Everybody's filled with contradictions. But if you want a sense of Neoplatonism, that's probably the best introduction. So as you go through Maimonides' Guide for the Perplexed, he goes from an Aristotelian idea of God into a more Platonic idea of the forms. Now, it's a difficult book. It's not easy to go through. But if you just went to the to the web and you wrote in Jewish Neoplatonic text, you might come up with Solomon Ibn Gabriel's The Fountain of Life, Mekor Chaim, etc. So they are out there. So there are these two traditions exist in Judaism. The Gnostic tradition, that we live in a world of evil and darkness. The Neoplatonic is that we're at the end of a series of lenses and veils. You actually see them merging in the Midrashic tradition, the Talmudic tradition, as well as esoteric texts that are pushed out of the Jewish canon, but still copied and studied all the way down into the 12th century, which is our focus. So just a few last things I wrote in my Shabbat thought. A few things happen in Provence in the late 1100s. First, a book called Bahir shows up that has its own emanatory system, not yet called Sfirot, the emanations we have of the Kabbalah. So you have ancient texts, the book Bahir shows up. You have a resurgence of Neoplatonism in the south of France. Remember, Christianity has always had an uneasy relationship with Neoplatonism. It's definitely not indicated in the New Testament, but the early church fathers had an ongoing dispute about the value of Greek philosophy for Christianity. By the way, if you want to read a book on that, there's a book called Christ and Culture by H. Richard Niebuhr that talked about the relationship of the early church with philosophy, sometimes praising philosophy as a way to understanding God, sometimes objecting to philosophy. So the resurgence of Christian Neoplatonism certainly had a place, and also the resurgence of Gnosticism, as I wrote in my Shabbat thought, the Cathar movement, C-A-T-H-A-R, very disturbing heresy that grew up in France in the 1100s as well, if I'm not mistaken, viciously and brutally put down by the Catholic Church. But you might say that the debris remained of this interest in Gnosticism, plus the rabbis of Narbonne, Languedoc, Provence said that there was an experience of the prophet Elijah, the Ruach HaKodesh going through the area we would call today spiritual fervor. All these things came together. So what happened that created the Kabbalah, which will go into my talk today? Two things. First of all, I've spoken about the Sefer Yetzirah. I want to share with you my traditional copy of Sefer Yetzirah. Isn't this a great cover? Sefer Yetzirah. I just love having this book. Sefer Yetzirah is actually a very, very brief text. This is filled with commentaries on Sefer Yetzirah. So everybody knows what the text is. Nobody knows what it means, or there wouldn't be commentary after commentary after commentary filling this this wonderful book. So one thing that happens in Sefer Yetzirah is at the very beginning of the book of formation or the book of creation, it says, Bishloshim ushtayim nitivot pliot chokhmah, with 32 mystical paths of wisdom engraved Yah. the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, the living God, King of the universe, El Shaddai, merciful and gracious, high and exalted, dwelling in unity, whose name is holy. He is lofty and holy. He created his universe by the means of 3 Sfarim. These are all spelled the same. Sefer, book, number, Sfar, and Sipur. It's like a telling or an account. So many scholars say there's a Pythagorean feeling that the idea of a number mysticism. So so we have here for the first time the term Sefirot. Okay, so 10 Sefirot or divine numbers. So what are the Sefirot? Well, in the text of Sefer Yetzirah, chapter 1, paragraph 5, it says the following. Eser Sefirot Blima. The 10 Sefirot of Blima, we're not sure what that means. Bli means without, Ma means anything. So 10 Sefirot of, you might say, nothingness, insubstantial, not having material reality. Their measure is 10. It says, Midatan Eser She'ein Lahem Sof, which are infinite. And then Sefer Yetzirah enumerates the 10 Sefirot, the 10, as it were, divine numbers or divine creative thoughts. Here they are. It says, Omek Reshit, the depth of beginning. Omek Achari, the depth of the end. Omek Tov, the depth of good. Omek Ra, the depth of evil. Omek Rom, the depth of the heights. Omek Tachat, the depth of the depths. Omek Mizrach, the depth of the east. Omek Ma'arav, the depth of the west. Omek Tzafon, the depth of the north. Omek Darom, the depth of the south. Yachid El Melech Ne'eman, Moshel Bekulam, Mimaon Kocho, Ad Ade Ad. And then the singular master, God, the faithful sovereign, dominating over all of them from his holy dwelling, eternity to eternities. So what are the Eser Sefirot of Sefer Yetzirah? I've just listed them to you. I believe you can find the text online in Hebrew and in English. In Sefer Yetzirah, chapter 1, paragraph 5, it actually enumerates them. They are never presented in Sefer Yetzirah as the 10 Sefirot of the Kabbalah. This is a rabbinic, Neoplatonic, Gnostic text, not a Kabbalistic text. Now, what has happened is, as time has gone on, because it mentions Eser Sefirot, people have gone back and retrojected the 10 Sefirot emanation of the Kabbalah into this text. I'm not saying it's a bad way to study. Many people derive great benefit from studying the book this way. Just from an historical critical perspective, it's a mistake. So we're going to put that aside. But what has happened is the term Sefirah is deposited into Jewish mysticism. So now you have the 10 Ma'amarot of Sefer Bahir, the Eser Sefirot of Sefer Yetzirah, and someone decides to call the 10 Ma'amarot of Sefer Bahir, to call them Sefirot. So they're married together, as it were. And the 10 emanations of the Kabbalah are no longer called Ma'amarot, meaning speech sayings of God. They are now called Sefirot. Well, when does this happen? When does it happen that the 10 Sefirot of Sefer Yetzirah, which I've described, are now the 10 Sefirot of the Kabbalah? When does it happen? We actually know when and by whom. And this is the magic date. Because if I take out my traditional Sefer Yetzirah and I read the history of commentaries all the way into the 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th centuries, something shifts with a commentary of a rabbi in the south of France, Rabbi Yitzchak. I believe Yitzchak ben David. He was called Yitzchak Sagi Nahor, meaning filled with light. In Hebrew, they don't call someone blind. They call them Sagi Nahor, filled with light. So they call him Isaac the Blind. You can look him up. I actually believe they called him Sagi Nahor because he was filled with light. There's no way to prove one way or the other. His commentary on Sefer Yetzirah is the first time, as far as we know, that the 10 Sefirot are understood in this emanatory system that later becomes the Kabbalah. So when is the Kabbalah, as it were, born? Our best date south of France, 1170s, by Rabbi Yitzchak Sagi Nahor and his family, which means this was a teaching he received from his grandfather, his father. It was going around the south of France. As far as we know, this was his commentary on Sefer Yetzirah is the first extended text. Now, again, without going into too much complexity, there's actually a treasure trove of texts that come down from that period. It's just stunning to me that they have been preserved. Gershom Scholem has studied all of them. So in his books, he shows that between 1170 and 1270, there was just a profusion of discussing this idea of the 10 emanatory levels, from all the way from the infinite down to the lower level. And this idea more or less took over, created Jewish mysticism. Now, this is very important. There is no agreement on what the names were. There is no agreement on what the content of the emanation was. There wasn't even agreement on how many. Some had 10, 3 on the top, 3 on the bottom. Some had a total of 13 for the 13 attributes of God. So as I've been past year, sadly, like many of us downsizing people, had to get rid of thousands and thousands of volumes that I've collected over my adult life. I've bought very few books. People say, I'd like to give you a book. I said, send me a Kindle credit. I'd be happy with my Kindle library. Well, this is a book that I bought. It is one of the finest books I've ever owned. It's called The Kabbalistic Tree of Life. See it right here. It's expensive. It's a sturdy book. It's a wordy book. It's a heavy book. But what it has, this author has collected across the planet every depiction of the Kabbalistic Tree of Life available to humanity. Okay? Every depiction. Page after page after page of manuscripts from obscure libraries all over the world of depictions of the Kabbalistic Tree of Life in all of its variety, with all of its different names, with incredible commentary. So I just want to open up one. Here is an early depiction of the Kabbalistic Tree of Life. Let me get it out here to the camera. How's that? Can everybody see it? Okay, here's an early depiction of the Kabbalistic Tree of Life. Now, let me just show you something here. Now I'm going to actually look at it. Can you see that there are the common depiction of the 10 Sfirot? I think you can all, if you know what the common depiction of the 10 Sfirot, that's not the names here. The top one is not called Ein Keter, it's called Eheyeh. As far as I can make out, we have a series of the names of God. Eheyeh, Yehiyeh, there's one I can't make out, El, Yud-He, Vav-He, et cetera, all the way down to the bottom where it says Adonai. So in this depiction of the Sfirot, it's an emanation of the names of God. So what we learn is one interpretation from, let's say, 1170 to 1270 of what was the emanatory system, just one, was an emanatory system of the names of God. It was a names mysticism. If you want to look at one person, Abraham Abulafia was a pre-Zohar Kabbalistic mystic who focused on the ecstatic recitation of names of God. That was one path that was taken. It's clearly more of a Neoplatonic path, okay? Meaning names of God funneled from the infinite all the way down to the commonly used word Adonai as a mystical practice, ascending and descending. This is a kind of a pure Jewish expression of Neoplatonism. Okay, so we're going to call that the mystical practice that developed between 1170 and 1270. Most notable person is Abraham Abulafia. But another practice was the philosophic practice of figuring out what this was. The best analogy I can give to you is, let's say, when the idea of rights came into being sometime in the, I'll say, 1500s, Recht in German went from being right as law to Recht, meaning a right that people had. Now, that was a fundamental moment in human history, the changing of the word right from right and wrong to something human beings have spiritually granted by God. I spent a long time studying this. It's impossible to overstate what happened when the idea of human rights came into the world. It's earth-shattering, earth-shaking. You know, when the student said to me, isn't it all societal constructs? I said, yes, but society gets deconstructed and then reconstructed. So the divine right of kings was deconstructed, and human rights reconstructed a new societal construct. So societal constructs don't determine how we think. I think moral intuitions determine how we think, and then we construct society out of those moral intuitions that are based on ideas of moral realism, meaning people actually do have rights. That's an analogy. So everybody, let's say, as a moral premise or spiritual premise, yes, there are 10 sfirot. We don't know what their names are. We don't know what they mean, but we know it's worthwhile searching for an answer because we know they exist. So a very famous text came into being, either Asher ben Azriel or Azriel ben Asher, called Beur Eser Sfirot, the explication of the 10 Sfirot. It's pre-Zohar, but it's a back and forth with an imaginary teacher and a shoel, sometimes called Sefer HaShoel, the book of the student, the asking student, describing the 10 Sfirot before they had been standardized. So there's only one other picture I want to show you from this book. Let's see. So here's another depiction, very early, sorry, I don't want to hurt my book. Early depiction of the 10 Sfirot. Can you all see this? So just try to imagine these depictions just go page after page. By the way, I'll bring this to our May 27th meetup at Sherry Manning's ordination. I'll put it on the table. I'll have a guard next to it, and you can all put gloves on and thumb through the book, and you'll see this really extraordinary text. So they were from 1170 to 1270. I want you to try to imagine there were a few paths. One was the ecstatic path, the path of divine names, Abulafi, if you want one word, one name. And then the path of let's try to define what the Eser Sfirot are. By the way, even until today, the names of the Sfirot are not entirely in conformity. You'll find, if you investigate enough, some have different names from the one you might know. For example, the third Sphira, the third of the lower seven Sphira, sometimes is called Tiferet, beauty, sometimes called Emet, truth. I like to say Tiferet Emet, or Emet, Tiferet Emet, beauty and truth. I just use both because I find beauty and truth in many ways deeply intertwined with each other. By the way, in the Sphira called Hod, which is splendor, Chabad says it's short for Hodaya, which is gratitude. Now, I just disagree with Chabad. I think if Netzach is Moses and prophecy, Hod is the architecture of the beauty of the Mishkan. That seems like a good balance. They say this is Netzach Moses and this is Hod gratitude. That doesn't make sense to me. It doesn't work as a spiritual system. But see, I'm going back to the early days of the Kabbalah when we didn't know what the Sefirot were. We didn't know what they meant. We didn't understand their meanings, but we knew there was a meaning to be achieved. So this is the main takeaway for those of you interested in the spiritual psychology of the Kabbalah. They don't have a fixed meaning. They don't have a fixed meaning. We know this from the first century of the Kabbalah. I'm now going on the more philosophic side, where people are trying to figure out their meaning. So how do I have my meaning of the Sfirot? When I use the Sfirot in my own spiritual psychological practice, my rule is efficacy. What makes sense? What works? What helps me in my spiritual practice? And that's what I want to suggest to you. Now, again, I strongly encourage getting to know the Sfirot from the counting of the Omer, from Chesed down to Malchut between Pesach and Shavuot. That's what I did. That's how I got to know them. But then you might say, in addition to that practice, by the way, it's a practice that I've stopped. I it's so well known to me, I'd rather do my other practice, which is I have the lower 7 sfirot that we typically count between Pesach and Shavuot. I understand the mystical dimension of the upper sfirot. What I like to do is look at the system and see where my soul wants to go in. Does my soul want to go in, without naming them, at one level or another? So it's as if my soul tells me what to do with this map called the Sfirot. So they're developing between 1170 and 1270. By the way, one of the, now this is a book that's from the end of that period, but it's in English. This is by Avraham ben Yosef Gikatia. Joseph Gikatia means his dad was Shorty, Shorty Joe. So his name was, if I'm not mistaken, Avraham ben Yosef, the little guy, Gikatia from Chiquita in Spain. We don't know how tall the son was. We just know his father was of short stature. Well, in this book, we have actually The Gates of Light by Rabbi Joseph Gikatia. We have an enumeration of the 10 Sfirot as he understood. He's born in 1848. So if you see the table of contents here, okay, he has his understanding, let's say, by the 1860s, 70s of how he understood the 10 Sfirot. It's been ably translated. If you can, find it in a way that won't bust your budget, and you're really interested in the early Kabbalah, this is a good book to have. All right, so that's my my presentation of the early history of the Kabbalah. There are many different paths, mostly the path of language mysticism, Abrahalaphia. I've studied Abrahalaphia. It doesn't really speak to me. I mean, I tried, reciting the, whatever it was, the 48 names of God for an hour at a time. It really, I didn't have an ecstatic prophetic experience. Maybe it's me. I don't know. There are other meditative practices that I prefer. I gave it a try. Didn't work. I actually much preferred the philosophic books that I have of ancient rabbis discussing, well, what are they? How do they work? What are their names? What's their inner dimension? I've also studied Isaac the Blind's commentary on the Sefer Yetzirah. It's in English. It's hard to find, but you can just type in Isaac the Blind's commentary on Sefer Yetzirah, and you'll eventually find it, as did I. So next, what's the next thing that happens? I'll introduce this. Again, this is an amazing development that when you look back on it, seems predictable and necessary, but it was it changed the life of the people of Israel. So I want you to think for a moment. Clearly, we have our Sefer HaTorah, the book of the 5 books of Moses and other parts of the Bible. We have an extensive midrashic tradition that really tries to pull apart not the meaning of the Bible, but the meanings the Bible can bear. So midrash is not the meaning of the text of the Bible. It's ascriptions of meanings that the text perhaps can bear. So midrash is really studying the mind of the rabbis. Hope that's clear. The moment came where people began to ask, how do these 10 sfirot operate as interpretive tools for studying Torah? So the idea was, well, we have these 10 sfirot, I'll put that here. We have the Torah here. What happens if we push the Torah through the 10 sfirot? What comes out the other side? So the Zohar is not the code to understanding the Torah, as some people have said. It's not a bad term, it's just not an accurate term. The Zohar is the decision to apply the 10 sfirot as interpretive tools to create an entirely new meaning of the Torah, the Kabbalistic meaning. Okay, that's step 1. Step 2 is, by this time, the Neoplatonic Kabbalah, which means the Kabbalah of the lenses, and the Gnostic Kabbalah means the Kabbalah of what we'll call this mythology of evil. They coexist in Spain where this happens. So the center of the Kabbalah goes from the south of France to the north of Spain. And it turns out that there are geographic centers. Some are more Gnostic, some are more Neoplatonic, and the rabbis in these centers write their own pamphlets and treatises on how to apply the Sfirot to the Kabbalah, including the idea of where evil comes from, and so forth. It's an extensive study. There are entire books on primeval evil in the Kabbalah. This is all happening in the in mostly northern Spain in the mid 1200s. A truly brilliant Kabbalist is tuned into this. Moshe de Leon, he's born in 1240 in Leon, and he decides to, number one, compile these pamphlets, some Gnostic, some Neoplatonic. Gershom Scholem, by the way, has detected 20 different genres in the Zohar. So it is not a book, it's a library of different genres, roughly congealed around Gnostic, Neoplatonic, with many different midrashic formulas. So if you know the midrash, by the way, Arthur Green's introduction to the Zohar, he introduces the Zohar as a Kabbalistic midrash. So what does the Zohar do from my perspective? It brings back Gnostic myth into Judaism. Remember, Gnostic myth was pushed out. The Kabbalah brings back in Gnostic myth. Sometimes when you study the Kabbalah, study the Zohar, it's just astonishing. The complexity of these Gnostic myths. It's as if Gnostic myths were just waiting for a chance to reappear. Then in the hands of Gnostic Spanish rabbis, it just returned with a kind of a, poetic vengeance. I don't think vengeance is too far off a term for Gnosticism. Moshe de Leon had studied this. So most of the Zohar seems to be his creation, although much of it is his earlier works that he translated from Hebrew into Aramaic, the works of other people that he translated from Hebrew to Aramaic, and then his own vast writing, which he wrote in basically first century Aramaic. So the Zohar is mostly in Aramaic. It is an artificial Aramaic because it wasn't the Aramaic of people who spoke Aramaic. It was Aramaic of people who learned Aramaic from studying the biblical translation from Hebrew into Aramaic. So it's 12th century fabricated Aramaic based on 2nd century Aramaic. Now, how do we know this? Well, there are some times that De Leon is looking for a word and he can't find it in Aramaic, he can't find it in Hebrew. So what he does is he transliterates it from Spanish. So there are words in the Zohar where people say, what word is this? Where did he get it from? Well, it's a Spanish word right there in the Zohar, translated in Aramaic. The other times he's trying to say something, so he uses a Spanish idiom, translated into Aramaic. The idiom that he might use, for example, when we say step on the gas, we don't mean pour gas on the ground and step on it. If someone says step on the gas, well, that's an idiom, and you can probably locate the idiom sometime after the internal combustion engine. That's probably when that idiom came into being. So people look in the Zohar and they find idioms that don't occur in any ancient Aramaic, don't occur in ancient Hebrew, and only exist in Spain at the current time. It's a Spanish idiom translated literally into Aramaic. So Scholem has done a thorough study of the Zohar, and he's decided, mostly by Moshe de Leon, who spoke Arabic and Spanish, composed the book in an artificial Aramaic, purporting it to be the work of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai from the 2nd century. That's actually just impossible because Shimon Bar Yochai in the 2nd century did not speak Spanish. So that should be conclusive evidence, although I could give you the pages of Scholem's evidence. So what do we have? When you look at the Zohar, think of a collection of treatises and pamphlets from different rabbis in different parts of Spain, some Gnostic, some Neoplatonic, some combined. Most of the work of Moshe de Leon, who himself was that interpretation of Jewish Gnosticism, Jewish Neoplatonism, 20 different genres in the Zohar, purporting to be a midrash on the Torah, but which is actually 100 years of Neoplatonic, Gnostic, names of God, philosophical speculation. By the year 1270, it's become a system, and the Torah is, as it were, pushed through this system. Simplistically speaking, out comes the Zohar. So now, my last word to all of you. Is it worth studying the Zohar? From my perspective, if you really are mostly interested in the spiritual psychology of Kabbalah, it's not worth it. It's interesting, it's poetic, it's deep, it's extraordinary, it's wonderful poetry. It's just too much, really, if you're interested in studying the Sfirot for spiritual psychological depth. So a page here, a page there, as you're studying something, it says, go look at the Zohar, volume 1, page 122b, go look at volume 2, 17a. Look up anything you want in Danny Matt's translation. I was studying Zohar page after page after page, and I realized I'd rather just look stuff up after maybe my first 100 pages in the Aramaic. I said, I'm actually not going to read the entire Zohar. I will look things up. I'm glad I have it. I'm glad I can look things up. I would rather spend my time studying Hasidic literature, Lurianic literature, than reading the entire corpus of the Zohar. Again, I'm glad I have it. I like referring to it. The poetry is beautiful. But it is not my spiritual practice. Now, for some people, it is their spiritual practice, and that's you. Good for you. I would only say, get your Hebrew to be intermediate Hebrew. From intermediate Hebrew, you can easily learn Aramaic, and try to study it in the original. It's not beyond any person listening to this program. Intermediate Hebrew is pretty simple. The intermediate Aramaic is even more simple than intermediate Hebrew. It's the same repetitive vocabulary, just used in amazing metaphoric ways. So it's linguistically not beyond anybody here. You just have to give it a couple of years of your life to get to intermediate Hebrew and then into intermediate Aramaic. And the text will appear to you in a different way, partly because the text is so musical. Clearly, the Zohar is meant to be chanted, memorized, and used for ecstatic experience. The closest I've seen come to that is Daniel Matt's translation, which in many ways is poem-to-poem translation. And that's one reason I strongly advocate using Daniel Matt's translation. I actually don't know if anybody uses any other translation except the one provided for the Kabbalah Center, which in my mind is, compared to Daniel Matt, it's a rather mediocre translation. The problem is they were giving them out free everywhere. There was a certain time when I think it went to law offices and gave them away. And there was a time when people were emptying out their law offices, and we probably every week we got another 20-volume edition of the Kabbalah, at our doorstep, and we just had to take them down to the library and drop them at their doorstep. There are so many of these Kabbalah-centered translations out there. They're not that great. They're functional. If that's all you have, fine. If you can, use Daniel Matt. All right, that takes us up to 1300. So what you've heard me do is when you do the spiritual psychology of Kabbalah, for example, when you look at the Sitra Achra, when you look at the left hand of God, etc., that's really there. That was put in the Kabbalah in that first century. It's in the Zohar. So understanding the Gnosticism in the Sfirot is really important. Understanding the Neoplatonism of the Sfirot is really important. Understanding there's no actual original version of the Sfirot. That's really important for you to know, which means you can be led by your intuitions on what a given Sfirot means, which means if you read a book on the Sfirot, even the one that I might write, I give you my interpretation, let's say, of Tiferet Emet, and you've been meditating on the system for a few years, and you go into the inner depths of Tiferet Emet, and you say, wow, I think that doesn't seem to be right. This works for me. Well, there is a Sfirah called Tiferet Emet. I put them together. The meaning is not, how shall I say, canonical. My meaning is a product of my personal contemplation and meditation. When you really get into the system, you might come up with your own meanings. Your meanings are just as valid as my meanings or anyone else's meanings. There have been times when I've taught Kabbalah, and there'll be someone from I'll call it the more traditional community in the room. They say, well, where'd you get that from? I said, I got it from studying the Kabbalah. Well, I've never heard it before. I said, because I'm the first guy to say it. Well, what gives you the right to produce new meanings of the Kabbalah? I said, the same right the first 100 years of people had is nobody knew what it meant. people were trying to figure it out by what seemed right. So that's another, again, a basic thing I want to give you is there is no stable canonical meaning to the Sfirot. You do your work, whatever you come up with. If it's efficacious for you, you might say it's as right as anybody else. So now I would also say in the order of the studying of the Sfirot, this is the last thing I'll say this morning. You see, when I go into the study of the Sfirot, again, for most of my adult life, I did the counting of the Omer practice, 1 week Chesed, 1 week Gevurah, etc., until I just knew it by heart, which means repeating that it lo chidesh li shum davar, nothing new happened within me. So I prefer to sit and I look at it, and I've been with it so many years, it's as if the meanings are lodged in my soul. I look at it, and it's as if I wait for my soul where to go in. Am I going to go into a higher level, the primal point of creation? Will I go into Keter and the Ein Sof, which is a names of God meditation, the Yud He Vav He in many different forms? It's a very deep thing. Using the upper Sfirot as prisms shaped by the name of God to take infinite light, shine them through a prism, and have that prism enlighten the soul. This is one of the uses of the upper 3 Sfirot and the Ein Sof beyond that. By the way, you will find this in Chabad Hasidism, exquisite treatises on using the names of God in the upper 3 Sfirot as prisms for reflecting the divine light down into your soul. I mean, when I discovered this, it truly changed the contours of my contemplative meditative light. Other days I might start at the bottom in Shekhinah Malchut, the brokenness of God. Other days I might start with the brokenness of Gevurah that spawns the Sitra Achra, the Gnostic evil. So my practice, and I'm not saying my practice should be your practice, I just want to share with you the things I'm sharing with you liberated me from. There's only one set of names of the Sfirot, there's a stable set of meanings of the Sfirot, and there's only one order to study the Sfirot. I was liberated from that by the things I'm sharing with you. So my study of the Sfirot, the spiritual psychology of the Sfirot, is not wedded to stable meanings, it's not wedded to a stable order. It's more intuitively, what does my soul need, and on what journey is my soul taking me? How do I arrive at that? From studying, from an historical critical perspective, the history of the Kabbalah, including the prehistory, including the study of the Zohar, and that has shaped my practice. Now, the next step is, again, we're going to fast forward a few hundred years. Who was Isaac Luria? What did he add to all this? And how did he set the foundations for the Hasidic study and use, and I would say creation, of the spiritual psychological practice of the Kabbalah? All right, that concludes